everybody, and welcome to Week 3 or Module 3, the Renaissance Art of 15th Century Italy. The Quattrocento, a changing economic and social landscape. In Week 3, we leave Northern Europe for a while and return to Italy at the start of the 15th century, or the 1400s. As we learned back in Weeks 1 and 2, the early Middle Ages has been a period of artistic patronage for powerful and religious entities like the Holy Roman Empire and the Catholic Church. Both were adequately wealthy to patronize enormous amounts of artwork. Due to this mostly non-secular control of the art market, work in Western Europe was necessarily Catholic in its subject matter, especially with the general medieval distaste for anything from the pre-Christian pagan world. But by the late Middle Ages, things were changing. As we've discussed before, rural feudalism as a form of economy and social control was beginning to fade in favor of urban-located culture and society in the 12 and 1300s. Trade and commerce were growing in importance in Italy, as in Northern Europe. Members of an emerging middle class associated with commerce, like merchants and bankers, were beginning to make their own wealth without the direct help of old feudal powers and, quote-unquote, old money. While newly wealthy families in Quattrocento Italy were pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, there is no mistaking it for the middle and upper middle classes of the Netherlands of Northern Europe. In Italy, privilege and influence could be bought, so to speak, by the newly wealthy, whose families could ascend to a power comparable with the aforementioned old money. Compare this notion with the Flanders and Holland of the same era, where the old-moneyed families were marrying their children off to the offsprings of merchants and bankers in order to keep their high social status and influence. The city-states of Italy. It may surprise you to learn that before the modern era, Italy was not really a country with a central government. It was a collection of independent city-states who formed allegiances inside and outside of Italy. In the 15th century, powerful families, some of them newly wealthy from banking and trade, were in control of these city-states. During the era of their rise to power and throughout the Renaissance, the city-states of Italy were sometimes at war with one another. Often controlling families within city-states were in conflict as well. Your textbook lists for you some of the most important and long-lived of these family dynasties. The Gonzaga family of Mantua, who later married into the Holy Roman Empire. The Sforza of Milan, who were famous condottieri or mercenary military generals. The Este of Ferrara, who had very close ties to the papacy, as well as connections to Frankish and German rulership. And the Medici of Florence, whom we will discuss further below. The map on the screen shows the borders of the city-states. Notice the north is divided into several rather urban duchies and republics, including Florence, while in the south, the Vatican, or the Papal States, and Naples control vast portions of land. The Medici family. The Medici have come to personify a new patrician ideal of the Renaissance. While the Medici came to be known as aristocracy for its leadership role in the Republic of Florence, the family's wealth came originally from middle-class work and sale of textiles, rather than through feudal fealty. For this reason, the Medici were still considered, quote-unquote, one of us, friends of the people of Florence. But in reality, the family owned the wealthiest bank in Europe and would eventually produce several cardinals and 4 popes. They were well connected to both new and old money throughout Florence through deal-making and betrothals. At the beginning of the Quattrocento, the Medici's family's ambitions caused it to be embroiled in a scandal that resulted in the family being temporarily banned from Florentine politics. But the family gained support of the people through their promotion of a fair tax system. This led to Cosimo de' Medici's ascension to the role of Grand Maestro of Florence, an unofficial but extraordinarily powerful title. In 1434, on the screen you can see a medallion depicting Cosimo the Elder. Over the next century, members of the Medici family will vie for power and control, while making names for themselves as some of the most important and prolific private art patrons in the world. With the new affluence of wealthy families like the Medici, art's patronage became a statement of wealth and power. Early on during the Quattrocento, the city-state of Florence, where the Medici family rose to power, became a major center of Renaissance art. The photo on the screen shows the Piazza and Palazzo della Signoria, the seat of power of the Republic of Florence, which we also saw in Module 1. Renaissance and the end of the so-called Dark Age. Western art historians refer to the Quattrocento in Italy as the century in which the Renaissance began. Indeed, you have already heard me use this word to describe this time and place. Renaissance is a French word that means rebirth. Although the Renaissance is understood to have begun in Italy, the French term Renaissance is used more often in scholarship over the virtually identical Italian term Rinascimento. You can read an excellent explanation of the term Renaissance and how it came into use in an excerpt taken from Shearer West's Bulfinch Guide to Art History, which is linked in the online lecture. Although, as your book points out, the term Renaissance only comes into use in the modern era, Renaissance as a cultural idea in the West originates in the 14th century. Early 14th century scholars, especially philosophers, poets, and other writers, felt that their own time period marked a lively end to a vast era of cultural decline, the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages was then, and still today, understood to begin with the end of the Great Roman Empire in 475 CE and conclude sometime around 1400 CE. Scholars in early Renaissance Italy sought to distance themselves and their ideas from their immediate predecessors in the Middle Ages. The rebirth imagined by these scholars was the resuscitation of the ancient world after the death of culture in the Middle Ages, so to speak. To these early Renaissance thinkers, their own culture was not derived from culture of the Middle Ages, but from ancient Greco-Roman culture. In fact, it was the late Gothic or early Renaissance Italian writer Petrarch who first used the pejorative Dark Age to refer to the Middle Ages. Of course, according to Shearer West and the vast majority of historians, this idea is no longer supported by history. Certainly, early Renaissance writers Petrarch, Boccaccio, and others were influenced by art and culture of the Middle Ages, even as they sought to rebel against it. They even cite specific medieval authors like Dante Alighieri as influences. The same could be said for the visual arts of the Renaissance. Visual artists claim to look back to the ancient Greco-Roman art world alone for inspiration. However, the vast majority of visual artists cite specific medieval artists like Giotto as influential on their work. Humanism and individualism. In the first module, we started to get to know the concept of humanism, according to Stockstad, a worldview that focused on human beings. Perhaps more so than any other concept, understanding humanism is crucial to understanding the art and culture of the Renaissance. Although we know that, despite scholars' claims, Renaissance art and culture were highly influenced by the Middle Ages, one of the ways in which Renaissance art forms differ from medieval ones is in their humanism. As this module unfolds, you'll see how artists and architects work to incorporate humanist ideals into their work, even when on the surface their works may appear mostly medieval in style. While a Renaissance humanist scholar or artist was ultimately interested in God and the beyond, his or her studies centered on the real world and people's plight. This new focus on human beings and the world they inhabit was advocated even by the highest powers of Florence, who saw humanism, at least in part, as a way to grow the power and prestige of the Republic, and to distinguish itself from other city-states and nations. The Medici founded a school for Neoplatonists, new followers of Plato, the classical-era Greek philosopher. In writing, humanism emerged as a focus on local language, over, perhaps ironically, Latin or Greek, which were seen as scholarly languages associated with the Catholic Church and relatively inaccessible to the public. Writers were also more interested in earthly love, which was often compared to spiritual love. In Renaissance art, humanism meant a renewed interest in several ideas related to ancient Greek and Roman art. The human figure became not only more prominent, but more realistic. This was not only in accordance with ancient Greek style, which favored the figure and often depicted it realistically, as in the Doryphorus on the screen. It was also a direct reaction against the medieval tendency to minimize the importance of the realistic figure in favor of a more abstract style. In addition to realistic depictions of the human figure, Renaissance artists sought to realistically render space. described at the time as in line with humanism in a number of ways. First, it meant that the artist created an earthbound, non-abstract or non-mystical vision of the world. Secondly, realistic space was intended to be an homage to ancient Roman paintings, like this one, which used linear perspective in a very intuitive or non-scientific way. Achievement and perfection. The Renaissance was very important in the course of art history for several reasons. For one, it's the era in which the individual artist becomes important, an idea that holds true even today. Over the course of the Renaissance, the status of the artist in intellectual society increases, and he or she is eventually considered a genius, with special skills and inborn talents that make him or her a superstar. This emphasis on artistic genius ultimately has resulted in the beginning of art history as we know it, with the book Lives of the Most Excellent Artists by Giorgio Vasari, published in 1550, a cover of which you're seeing on the screen. Unlike many other features of Renaissance culture, this idea was not rooted in the ancient Greco-Roman world, where artists were thought of as little more than laborers, but it was crucial to the progression of humanism. To think of an artist as an individual with unique earthly talents, if given to him or her by a Catholic God, seems very much in line with this new humanistic worldview. Along with individualism and genius came more Renaissance concepts: healthy but tough competition among artists, and the great achievement or masterwork. The great achievements of philosophers and writers were matched by painters, sculptors, and architects, all of whom sought to create a work for which he or she would be remembered. While the idea of the genius artist was new to the Renaissance, the idea that he or she could achieve perfection is one that may have originated with ancient Greece, especially during the classical period. A consciousness in one's place in art history, then, was also part of being a Renaissance artist. This accelerates in the High Renaissance, in the next module, and culminates in Lives of the Most Excellent Artists, the book you're seeing on the screen. This self-conscious attitude was certainly present in early Renaissance architect Filippo Brunelleschi. Brunelleschi, like other prosperous and talented Renaissance artists, used his skill for humanistic purposes, while at the same time making a name for himself in the annals of art history. A Renaissance person who was adept at many different art forms, Brunelleschi's name rose to high prominence in the early 15th century because of his participation in a competition for a pair of bronze doors that were to be made for the San Giovanni baptistry. Adjacent to the Florence Cathedral, or Duomo, you can see the octagonal baptistry in the foreground of the aerial view. Brunelleschi lost the competition. It was awarded to another young artist, Lorenzo Ghiberti. You can read more about the competition panels in your book. But young Brunelleschi's connection to the Duomo didn't end there. The cathedral had remained unfinished for many decades. The enormous dome that was planned for had never been completed. It seemed the dome was too large to be constructed properly and safely. Brunelleschi made a proposal to finish the dome without the need for difficult and costly armature. The effect of the raising of the dome on the civic pride of Florence cannot be overstated. The dome was so unlike anything from the prior Gothic period that to some it symbolizes the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance. Brunelleschi's 1417 design took nearly 20 years to finish. In the meantime, Brunelleschi was sought after for many other building and painting projects, including the Ospedale degli Innocenti. The humanism of the cathedral project was undeniable, but the Ospedale project was even more so. The Foundlings Hospital, which you can read more about in your book, was an orphanage commissioned by the Guild of Silk Workers and Goldsmiths. Not only was this project humanistic in its character, but it was also Renaissance in style. The portico, or covered porch, that extends around the courtyard is lined with columns reminiscent of ancient Greek orders, but with a new profile. The columns are thinner and shorter in ratio than their ancient counterparts. The round arches remind the viewer of ancient Rome. The long, low plan of the building was practical to the purpose of the structure. The beautiful glazed terracotta images of swaddled children in the roundels were added in 1487 and add to the humanistic atmosphere of the structure. In addition to public architecture, Palatial homes like the Palazzo Medici-Riccardi on the screen and the Palazzo Rucellai were also more humanistic in their spirit and Renaissance in their style. The Palazzo Medici-Riccardi served as headquarters for the busy and important Medici family. Although the home is enormous and grand, each floor is roughly 20 feet tall, it originally had a portico on the first floor that opened into the street. The palazzo is also right in the heart of the busy city. Once again, the rulership is no longer hiding away in more protected, isolated rural estates, but on the ground and accountable to the people. The interior of such grand palazzi was no doubt impressive. The profile of the interior especially is indicative of Filippo Brunelleschi's involvement. Palazzos, piazzas, public squares, cathedrals, and orphanages were all part of an overall vision of the perfect city. The ideal city, according to Leon Battista Alberti, is imagined in two paintings we're going to see shortly. The ideal city referred to ancient Greco-Roman style architecture with triumphal arches and arenas, and was set upon a clean, perfectly perspectival ground. This interest in Greco-Roman architecture gave Renaissance art an antiquarian feel, while inventive artists like Alberti and Brunelleschi altered the antique with a modern sense of proportion and purpose.